Hey everyone, and welcome to this video in which I'm going to show you how to make Space Invaders, the classic retro game, in JavaScript. Okay, very little CSS, very little HTML, no canvas. Okay, because we want to essentially use this game to really get to grips with our JavaScript. So this is what the finished product will look like. Like I said, it's super basic. This is because I want you to take the game, make it your own, style it up. It's going to be yours at the end. For those of you who have never played Space Invaders before, it is a great game in which you have the little guy right here, and he has to shoot down all these Space Invaders before the Space Invaders essentially get to him. So this is going to be a fun one for essentially inserting a lot of elements into HTML, so working with the DOM. I'm excited, let's do it. Okay, so let's do it. First off, I'm just going to start off on my IDE of choice, which is WebStorm, and I'm going to create a project. So I'm going to select new project, and this is going to be an empty project, which lives in WebStorm project. So a folder on my computer, or directory, however you want to call it. And I'm just going to call this JS space Invaders, like so, and click create. So this will create an empty project. Like I said, there will be no files or anything like that in here because we're going to have to add those in. Great, so now let's go ahead and create a new file. I'm going to create an index HTML file. So just like so, there we go with my boilerplate code. If you're using something else like VS Code, then please go ahead and create a folder and create the index HTML file and just copy this boilerplate code. Okay, so you might want to pause there. It is up to you. I'm just going to change the title of this document so this will show up on the browser tab. So for example, if I open this up, so in WebStorm, you can just click here, and it will open up a browser tab. You will see Space Invaders show up as the title of the document. Okay? Or if you're not using WebStorm, you can also copy the path, copy the absolute path to this file on your computer. So the index HTML file that lives in the folder JS Space Invaders, that lives in the folder WebStorm projects on my computer. It will be the same. Okay? Great. And I'm just going to go ahead and inspect this page so that we can see what is going on behind the scenes. Wonderful. So let's go back. So the index HTML, we're not going to really be doing much here, okay? I am simply going to essentially have a div. I'm going to give this you can give it the class of grids, or you can give it an ID. As I'm going to be styling this, I've chosen to give it a class name. So we can pick out this whole element, pick out the whole div by its class name. Okay? And we are doing that so we can inject stuff with JavaScript in between here. So essentially, I'm going to be adding a whole bunch of squares in here using JavaScript. But in order to do that, we need a script tag. So I'm going to put the script tag at the bottom. So after all the relevant or elements have been read, we then read the JavaScript. So to do this, we're going to use the source attribute, and this will help us link up the JavaScript file, which we of course need to make. So here I'm just going to create a new file. It's the JavaScript file. I'm just going to call this app.js, or app, as we've already specified. This is a JavaScript file, and it gives it the .js extension so that our code editor knows to treat this as a JavaScript file. Okay? If you need to add that JS manually, then please do, depending on your code editor of choice. Great. And this just means we now need to link up the index HTML to the app.js. As it's in the same place in the directory, I can simply put the file name. We don't need to go in and out of any folders or anything like that. Wonderful. And now I'm just going to also, while we are here, add an H1 element, as we're also going to want to insert stuff into here. And that's essentially the result. I'm going to start off with it being 0, but we will override this later by picking out the H1 element by its class name, which I'm going to use results for. So I've given the class name. Again, you could have given ID, but as I'll be styling this, I've chosen to give it a class name. But it is totally up to you. So there we go. That's literally everything, all the HTML that we're going to be putting in between these two body tags. And one last thing we need to do is actually link this up to a style sheet. So thanks tab 9, that's a great suggestion. We need to add rel style sheet, and then the href, we're going to put in the path to the file name. And as we don't need to go into any folders or anything like that, because I plan on putting that style sheet here. So once again, you can go style CSS, just make sure to spell it exactly the same way that you have spelled it in the href. Or if it's WebStorm, you can just click CSS. You don't need to add the CSS extension. And there we go. We've created a style CSS file. And our code editor knows to treat this as a CSS file and, you know, read the code differently than it would in the JS file or the HTML file too. So that's it. This is literally all the HTML that we're going to need. It fits nicely into this whole video frame. So pause here, copy it. Again, I will be putting the code in the description below if you get stuck. But hopefully this is relatively easy for you to follow along with. So cool, let's move on. Let's start off by actually styling the grid first. So let's pick out this whole element, the whole div, by the class name of grid, which means that in the style sheet, I need to grab that class name. So dot is for looking for class names, and I just grab grid, as that is the class name. So there we go. And all I'm going to do is give it a width of 300 pixels, a height of 300 pixels, as we want it to be a square. I'm also going to give it a border, okay, solid, 1 pixel, black. Again, this is going to be super basic styling, so I do hope you change it to be something way more interesting than I'm making right now. But essentially, here's our grid, and there's the result. And if we look in here, you will see that H1 element and the div with the class of grid. First off, let's actually get to adding lots of little squares in here, okay? So we're going to add squares because Space Invaders is a kind of grid-based game, and I'm going to show you how to do that now. So let's go back in here and let's pick out this whole element, the whole element by the class name of grid. So to do this, I'm going to use document, query selector, and look for an element with the dot. So dot is for class name of grid. Great. And let's save this as the const grid so we can work with it in our JavaScript. I'm just going to minimize this for now. Wonderful. The other thing we can do is grab the element, the H1 element by the class name of results. So perhaps let's do that now. So once again, document, query selector, and this time we are looking for an element with the class name of results. And once again, let's save this so we can work with it later. I'm going to save it as the result display. Okay, cool. Now, my square is going to be 15 by 15 squares, okay? So it's going to be a total of 225 squares. And in order to work with our JavaScript a bit better, I'm just going to hard code that width, as that is going to stay constant. And we're going to be using it a lot in this script, essentially. And the first thing we're going to use it for is actually creating squares. So I'm going to use a for loop for this. And as long as I is smaller than 0 and I is smaller than width multiplied by width, okay, because we essentially want to loop not just 15 times, but 15 by 15 times, so 225 times to create 225 squares to put in our 15 by 15 square grid. If that doesn't make any sense, I'm going to show you anyway. So that is a for loop. That is the syntax for a for loop. So this will essentially loop 225 times. And what do we want to do 225 times? We want to create the squares. So to do this, I'm going to use document once more, create element, and we're going to create a div. So let's save that as square maybe, not div. And at the moment, we're just creating the divs, but we're not doing anything with them, right? We know we want to put them in the grid. And to do that, I can grab the grid and use append child square. So each time this loops now, every time it loops 225 times, it's going to loop. Each time it's going to put in a square and put in a square and put in a square until we finish the loop and there's 225 squares in it. So at the moment, if I go back to here and refresh, and you won't see anything visually, but if we look in the div with a class of grid, it's got 225 divs in it. Of course, they don't look like squares, but that's because we haven't actually styled them as squares. We just put 225 divs in here, thanks to the append child method, in which we grabbed the grid and then used append child to put in a div. Each time it looped, 1 div, 2 divs, 3 divs, all the way until the loop was completed. Cool. So perhaps maybe let's style the div. I'm going to do so in here. So I can do this. I can say that any div that lives inside an element with the class name of grid, so make sure the space is there. Any div that lives inside an element with the class name of grid is going to have the following styling. I simply just want it to be 20 pixels by 20 pixels. Okay, and 20 times 15 does make 300, so that should fit in nicely. So now if I refresh, I'm going to show you what happens. That is one div, that is another div, all the way down. However, they go down like this, right? We don't want that to happen because at the moment it's going all the way down. We essentially want it to loop. So we want it to go, instead of going down all the way here, past the square and all the way down, so all 255 squares will go down, I want to go all the way across. So in fact, maybe I'll just style this up a little bit more so you can see what's going on. Let's do box sizing, border box, just so that it's inside. And let's make the border red so that border is now inside the div, not on the outside. And refresh. There are all the squares. And if I do on the grid display flex, so I'm initializing something called flexbox, all those divs will now squeeze into the top line. And if I do flex wrap, and save and refresh, they will now loop. So you will see, if I go back in here, the first square is here, second square, third square, fourth square, and so on, okay? So that is something that has now happened, and it's just going to wrap over and over again. So we've just put in 225 squares. That was pretty easy. I'm just going to get rid of this for now. Great. Let's carry on. So we have added the squares. The next thing we're going to do is create an array from these squares so we can work with it in our JavaScript file. So in order to do this, once again, I'm going to get document query selector all this time, and I'm going to look for any div that lives inside an element with the class name of grid. So I'm not using query selector, I'm using query selector all because we want to grab more than one element, and if we use query selector, it would just get the first element, okay, that it finds in the list. So query selector all in order to get all of them. And I'm actually going to wrap this in array from, because we want to create an array from this. Okay, and I'm just going to save this as squares. Of course, you have to do this after the for loop, right? Because if you do it before, there won't actually be any divs in the grid. So that is important. And I'm just going to console log squares for you so you can see what is going on. So if I refresh this now, ta-da, it's an array, right? Array from just means that we put all those divs in an array like so. Great, let's move on. Now, I'm going to essentially decide what indexes, so for example, the element or the div with index 0, as we start counting from 0 in computer science, is going to be that. This div has index 1, this div or element, it could be anything, will have index 2, and so on. So that is just a little bit of array work. Of course, if you need a refresher in that, please do check out my very extensive Code with Anya course. We are going to essentially decide which divs or which items in our array we want to put Space Invaders in, and we're just going to do so by picking out the index of them. So for example, let's go ahead, I'm just going to do Alien Invaders, and let's create an array, and I'm just going to put 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then I'm going to stop and put index 15, 16, 17. Let's go all the way to 23, 24. And then I'm also going to do 30, 31, 32, all the way to 38, 39. So that's where I want my initial Space Invaders to be. And let's write a function to essentially use this array and combine it with the array that we see here in order to show those Space Invaders on the grid. So my function, I'm just going to call it draw, like so. And once again, we're going to need a for loop. This time, however, we're not looping over the squares. We're going to loop over the alien invaders length. So essentially, however many items we have in here, that's how many times this loop is going to run. And what I'm going to do is actually get the squares. So we know this is an array. If you want a reminder, this is what the array looks like. And we're going to go into the array. So we open up those square brackets. And now I'm going to get the alien invaders array. Okay, and I want to open it up. So I'm going to open it up. I want to loop over the first item. Okay, so by putting an I, I'm essentially looping over this array. I'm getting that first item, which is a 0. So imagine this whole thing is essentially just a 0 on the first loop. That's essentially the same. And I'm putting that 0 into this squares array. So I'm getting this item right here, that first div. And once we have that div, I'm going to get class list, and I'm going to add a class that I'm going to make of Invader. Okay, so if I go ahead and call this function here, so just like so, and refresh, I'm just going to open this up, you will see that indeed the div with the index of 0 did get the class list of Invader added. So 0 got it added, 1 got it added, all the way up to 9 got it added, 10 didn't. This is because 10 doesn't exist, so we stopped, and then we started again at 15. So let's check if that is correct, and it is. So essentially, we've just added a class of invaders to all the indexes that we see here. So hopefully that makes sense. Maybe to make this a little bit easier, if I just remove this from the for loop, I'm going to remove this too. So here's my squares array, right? So once again, here's my array. If I wanted to add the class list of Invader to the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4th square, okay, how would I do it? Okay, ID 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So essentially 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 in the array. Well, since this is the squares array, what I would do is get the squares and pass through a 4. Because that will add the classes of Invader to the 4th square in the squares array. There it is. Okay, and this div does indeed have the class name of Invader. Great. So hopefully that makes sense. But instead of passing a number, I'm looping over the alien invaders array to get items in here. So for example, if I wanted to add the first item from the alien invaders array, I will get the array, I would open it up and pass through the first item. So now, where will the class list of Invader be added? Which square? The first one, that's right, and none of the others. So again, I hope that makes sense. Let's move on. Just going to uncomment that for now. Once again, if you're finding this difficult, please do check out my Code with Anya course over on codewithanya.com. Great. So now I'm just going to go ahead and actually create that class name. So if something has the class name of Invader, all I'm going to do is give a background color. Let's go ahead and make it purple. And I'm also just going to round it off. So I'm going to use border radius 10 pixel. Okay, so now that's essentially what our invaders are going to look like. While we're here, I'm just going to make some other classes. What I'm going to do is actually do one for the shooter. And I'm just going to make the background color green for this. So background color green. Let's also do so for the laser. So when we shoot the laser, I'm going to go background color orange. And then also for boom, when we actually hit something. So boom, the background color of red is going to be given to the square. So background color red. Great. And in fact, that's all this time I'm going to do. So I'm going to shut that down. Let's also shut down this file too. Wonderful. So we've got our invaders. What we should also do is I'm actually going to make another array here. For now, it's going to be empty, const invaders removed, okay? And it's going to be an empty array. This is because when we shoot an invader, we want to keep track of it. So we're going to put them in this array. This also means that whenever we draw the invaders, because we're going to essentially manipulate this alien invaders array, we want to check that the index of the alien removed will not be in there. So I'm just going to write if invaders removed. We did call them alien invaders here, so maybe let's just call them aliens removed, right? Because, you know, maybe that would be confusing. Alien invaders, aliens removed. If aliens removed, it does not include, right? This bang means does not, so this has to be false. Then we can add the class owner invader. So hopefully that makes sense. We're checking if something exists in aliens removed, and if it does not exist in there, then we can add the class of invader. Great. Let's move on. Now let's work on adding the shooter. So all I'm going to do is grab the squares like we saw. I'm going to open up the array, and where should we put the shooter? For now, I'm just going to put him in square 4 or index 4, and I'm going to use classless add shooter. So let's save that and refresh, and he's here. However, we don't want him to be there. We want him to be more down there. And in fact, I'm just going to save that as a constant. So const current shooter index. And let's make him start at square 202. So this is a const. I don't know if we should make this a let, as we should probably override it, as it is the current shooter index. So I'm just going to copy that, and then let's replace it here. So this is essentially the number 202. Okay, we've just saved it above as a constant. So now if we look in here, that is where my shooter is going to start. Let's move on. Now let's write a function to move the shooter. So I'm just going to use function move shooter, just like so. And once again, we're going to open up these squares. So we're getting these squares array, we're opening it up, and we're going to get the current shooter index. And then wherever he currently is, I'm going to remove shooter, right? Because we need to clean up after ourselves. We want to start fresh. And then I'm going to use this switch key. And then I'm going to use the switch, so the switch case, to pass through whatever key we press on the keyboard. So E key. And because we want to use the event, we need to pass through the event into this function. And now we're going to write a case. If we press arrow left, we of course want the shooter to go left. And to do that, we also need to make sure that we're not on the very, very most left part of the grid, right? Because if we are here, we don't want to move left, because essentially we'll go back in the array and we'll end up somewhere here, right? So if we are here, back in the array, we'll end up being here. So we don't want that to happen. So essentially we're going to check that we're not there first. If current shooter index modulus width does not equal 0, okay, because the width is 15. So for example, let's have a look here. 0, 1, 2, 3, all the way to here. This is index 14, index 15. So say we are here, or say we are 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30. Say we're in square with index 30. We don't want to be able to move to the left anymore. So if current shooter index is 30, modulus width, which is 15, 30 is divisible by 15 and leaves no remainder. So it would not pass this test, because we're saying if it doesn't equal 0. So if it does not leave a remainder, then we can move left. So we get the current shooter index and we -1 from it, which would mean we go back in the array 1. Okay? I know that's a bit complicated, but hopefully you'll see what I mean now. So let's try it out. And once we've done that, we will get the newest current shooter index because we've just changed it. And then after the switch case, we re-add the class of shooter. So now I am going to attach this to listen out for any key presses on the whole document. So I'm going to use document add event listener, key down, and we're going to move the shooter. So that is going to listen out to any time I press a key down on the document. And if that key that I press down is arrow left, it should move left. So refresh, we are here. And in fact, I'm just going to add the index of each of the squares so it's a little bit easier for us to work with them. I'm going to add the ID just like so. I'm going to get the square and use .id to add an index to it, which is just going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, just to make our lives easier. So now you will see each of those squares and it has an ID. So for example, if I am here, this is div with ID 202. That's right. It has a class of shooter. That should be right because that is what we essentially coded. So here we are. And if I press the arrow left, it goes to square with ID 201. If I press left again, the same thing will happen. And if I'm here, so square with ID 195, 195 is divisible by 15 and leaves no remainder. So essentially it does not pass this. Okay, it does not pass this. So we shouldn't be able to -1 to the current shooter index. So let's see. And we cannot move left. I'm pressing the arrow left and nothing is changing. So this works. This is looking really good. We did it. So now let's do the same for case arrow right. So I'm just going to copy all this and let's do case arrow right. And now if we just want to move to the right, well, we would add 1 to the current shooter index, right? So just do that and refresh and press the arrow right and we are going. However, if we go here, right, and if I go right, it appears there. We don't want that to happen, okay? This is not the correct behavior that we want. So when we are here, we need to recognize that we're in a square in this column and we need to not go right anymore. So in order to do that, we need another if statement. This time, I'm going to say if the current shooter index modulus width, so divisible by 15, and it is smaller than 15 minus 1, so smaller than 14, then we can move right. Otherwise, we can't. So that would make sense if we're in any squares, essentially all of these here, okay, but not in here, then we can move right. So, great. And I'm pressing the arrow right, I'm pressing the arrow right, and it's not letting me go anymore because essentially it does not pass this rule. Wonderful. So that's really it, okay? As the shooter, we only really want to be in this line right here. So we're not going to write anything for going up or down. Cool. Let's move on. If we didn't remove the shooter, I'm just going to show you what happens. I've just commented that out. We would essentially leave a line, right? So every time we essentially invoke the move shooter function, I want to start fresh. I want to remove the shooter from where we are and re-add it once we've manipulated the current shooter index here or here. Now let's write a function to move all the invaders. So move invaders, so just like so. And once again, we need to define what the left edge is. So left edge equals, and essentially we're going to use the same logic as we did here. So we're going to say whatever the first item is in it, okay, whatever index is there, if it's divisible by the width and equals 0, so leaves no remainder, we know that we are at the left edge. And let's do the same for the right. So const right edge Again, let's get the alien invaders. And this time we're going to get the alien invaders length, but we're going to -1 from it because we need the index number. And if that modulus width equals width -1, we know we're at the right edge. Great. Now, just with kind of clearing wherever the shooter is, we need to clear where the original invaders are, but all of them, right? Because we need to delete them from the grid and re-add them in their new position. So we can do that here, or we can write a function to do this because there is a lot of them. It's not as simple as just doing that. So let's write that function. I'm going to do so here. So function remove. And I'm going to use a for loop. Okay, so yes, we are looping over the alien invaders length. I'm going to get the squares and I'm going to get the alien invader array. I'm going to loop over it. I'm going to do class list remove invader. So great. So that will remove, you'll see it's similar to this, but of course we need to loop over the whole alien invader array in order to remove all of them. So now I can just call this function whenever I need to remove all the aliens. Great. Now let's go ahead and move the invader. So once again, a for loop is needed. I'm going to get each alien invader. I'm going to loop over it. And I'm just going to add 1 to it. Okay? So that is my move invaders function at the moment. And I'm going to put it in a set interval. I'm going to move invaders and I'm going to move them every 600 milliseconds. Okay, and I'm also going to assign this to an invaders ID because we are going to reset this to stop this from running. But at the moment, we just need to save this up here. So let alien invaders ID and not assign a value to it. So great. So now if I refresh this, after 600 milliseconds, all those aliens get removed, but we of course need to redraw them in their new position. So we're going to do so here. And we've already written this, so we're just going to reuse it. It's called the draw function, okay? Because essentially we've changed this array completely and we can use that array in order to redraw the aliens. So let's check it out. And amazing, there go our aliens. However, when we hit the side, exactly what I said happened. It's kind of splitting off into here. We don't want that to happen. We essentially want the aliens to change direction. So instead of going right, we need to go left if it hits the right edge. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to have to define a bunch of stuff. So let's go ahead and do that up here. I'm going to go ahead and put let is going right and just put it as true to start. And we're also going to define the direction. The direction at the moment, I'm just going to put as 1 and we're going to change that. So let's go down here. So let's actually wrap this all in an if statement. If we are at the right edge and we are going right, then we essentially want the alien invaders to go the other way, right? But we also want them to go down 1. So that means that instead of adding 1, we need to add width plus 1 instead and change the direction, like I said. So at the moment, the direction is 1. We need to change it to -1 and move is going right to be false, right? Because we want it to change direction. So let's see if that works. However, we now also need to write another loop. Again, we're going to get the alien invaders. I'm going to loop over each one. And this time, instead of adding 1 like we did before, I'm just going to add the new direction that we're going in. So it's either going to be a 1 or a -1, depending on everything that's happened up here. So let's see. So there we go. And we're going to hit the right edge and we should go down and then we change direction. And then if we hit here, well, we haven't written anything. So it's just doing its default of working through the array. So now let's write a rule for if it hits the left edge. So let's do it here. If left edge and is not going right, once again, we're going to write a for loop. let I equal 0, and as long as I is smaller than invader's length, increment I by 1. And we're going to get the alien invaders. We're going to loop over each one, and this time we're just going to get the width and -1 from it. We're also going to change the direction to be back to 1, and is going right is going to be back to true. So essentially we're resetting everything that we did here. Just make sure that that is a plus here, just like it is above. The only difference should be the +1 and the -1. So let's check it out. Okay, just refresh, and hits the right edge, goes down, and hits the left edge and should go down. And this is looking wonderful. I'm really happy with this. Now let's write something for if the Space Invaders hit the shooter. So this should be relatively easy. After we draw that, I'm just going to write if, and we're going to go into the squares, and we're going to get the current shooter index. Okay, so wherever he is at the moment, I'm going to check if it contains invader, because if the square that we are working with contains both classes, it means that the invader is visually over the shooter, and essentially it's a game over. So we're going to get the results display. We're going to get the inner HTML, and we're just going to put game over, right? Because essentially if that happens, it's a game over. The shooter has lost. He hasn't managed to shoot all the invaders before they got into his square. Cool. And we're also going to stop the game from running. So I'm going to clear the interval. I'm going to clear the invader's ID. So let's check it out. So we're just going to wait for that to go down. We should see game over appear here, and then the interval should stop running, meaning that essentially these shooters should stop moving. But we'll see if that works. We should have that happen in a bit. So let's just watch it go all the way down. We still need to write a function for actually shooting all the little space invaders. So that is something that we will also do next. Okay, and of course you can write as many, you can write other stuff that will happen on the game over. It's completely up to you. This is just a very basic example. And game over. Okay, so essentially we have lost. We can still move. So perhaps you might want to, remove the shooter. It is completely up to you, but the aliens aren't moving and we get a game over. So essentially the game, in my eyes, is over. The other thing we want to happen is actually check for if we win. So this time, well, this is essentially really easy. We'll just check the aliens removed length. Okay, so the length of the array, or in other words, how many things are in there. And if it equals the alien invaders length, we know that we've removed all the aliens off the grid. So the results display can be in HTML, you win, and then we clear the game again. So great. Of course, it's hard for us to actually test this out because we need to write the function to shoot down the invaders. So let's do so here. So function shoot. So in the function to shoot, we're going to have the laser essentially shoot off. And for that, we also need another set interval. So I'm going to save the laser ID in this function. We're going to clear it later. And let's go ahead and also get the current laser index, which we're going to make it start wherever the current shooter is. So I'm going to use the current shooter index. So I'm getting that and I'm setting that value to current laser index, which is let as it will change. Now let's write our function move laser inside here. And we're going to get the squares. We're going to pass through the current laser index. We're going to remove the class of laser, as once again we need to start fresh. So this is hopefully just some muscle memory of what we've been doing, because we're then later going to re-add the laser once we have essentially manipulated the current laser index. And where do we want our current laser index to go? Well, essentially we want it to go up. So we need to use the width variable in order to move it in the array 15 squares back. So we're going to get the current laser index, and we're just going to minus the width from it so that visually appears to be going up, because essentially if you are here and you minus 15, you will end up in the square with ID here. Okay, let's go ahead and remove this because we don't really need it anymore. That was just from demonstration purposes. So great, that is the move laser function in its kind of very base minimum. And what we're going to do is add that to a event listener. So document, add event listener, key down, shoot. And in here, so in the shoot function still, we're going to switch this out if the key, so let's pass through the event here as well. If the key we press is arrow up, then we're going to get the laser ID. We're going to do set interval, move laser, and we're going to move it 100. Okay, so let's try it out, and I'm just going to press up, and there it goes. So this is looking really, really cool. Great. And if I move wherever I go, that laser will start from my position. And in fact, we can also hit loads, okay? So it should shoot it each time. Great. In fact, we probably don't need a switch case, just if E key equals arrow up, and we want to do that. So we don't need the switch case after all. Great. We also don't need to do this. So let's check it out. And this is working as it should. I'm happy with that. Now, still in the move laser function, if squares, let's go into the squares and get the current laser index. If its class list contains Invader, then we want a few things to happen. Okay, so essentially if the laser index is in a square that already contains the class of Invader, we're going to go into the same square, so squares, current laser index, and we're going to remove the class of Invader. Let's also remove the class of laser, and let's also add the class of boom instead. So it should just be a red box instead of all the others. And then we want to remove that class, but after 300 milliseconds have passed. So for that, we use the set timeout. And what we're going to do is just get all of this, and we're going to remove boom, but only after 300 milliseconds have passed. Great, and once all that is done, I'm going to clear interval laser ID. Cool. So let's check it out. Just going to press the up arrow. Okay, great. So there we go. However, every time the aliens move, they're being re-added, right? We need to change the aliens removed array. So we need to add the aliens in order to remove them for when they are drawn again. So let's go ahead and do that here. Const alien removed, so singular. We're going to get the alien invaders, index of the current laser index. So we're essentially looking in the array to find out if the current laser index exists. And if it does, we'll save under alien removed. And then we're going to get the aliens removed array and push in that alien removed. Okay, so we're essentially saving the aliens removed in an array. We're also going to add 1 to the results. So let's add 1. In fact, let's also let results here, let's start off with it being 0. And of course, we also need to actually display it. So we're going to get the results display. We're going to get the inner HTML and just add the results. So I'm just going to console log aliens removed here so you can see what is going on. Make sure it's aliens removed plural and not alien removed. So now let's have a look here. So let's shoot. Let's get up the console log. Boom. Okay, so there we go. We are removing the aliens that we have hit. This is looking good. And finally, to get rid of the fact that, the laser should stop once it hits the first item and not continue, we need to essentially clear the interval. So this set interval we need to assign to laser ID and reset it so that that happens. So this is what it should look like. So now if I hit it, it hits one Space Invader and then stops. This is looking wonderful. I'm really happy with this. So there you go. I hope you've enjoyed this game. I really hope you can style it up, make it your own, expand on the functionality. This is, again, super, super basic just to get you going. And please do share your games with me because I'd love to see what you have made.